So here we are at the end of these lectures on moral psychology. Very sad, but it's not quite the end, because after all, it's now over to you to write some interesting things about the course. What can I say in conclusion? Not very much, because it's not really my job to be offering answers. My job as your lecturer is to take you through some of the problems and guide you to some interesting literature that might help with answering them. So what I can do in conclusion is just go back to the question that I asked at the start. Why study moral psychology at all? Why do that thing to yourself? There are lots of other ways that you could have punished yourself over the past 10 weeks. There are lots of other ways that you can torment yourself in writing a longer essay. Why is it moral psychology? Here are the reasons I gave in reverse order in relation to things that you said. The last of the reasons I gave is because it might, and that's very important, it's a might, shed light on ethics itself. Here I think the picture is a bit complicated. My view is that discoveries in moral psychology do tell us that we don't know things about ethics. We know almost nothing about ethics. And that's why I've suggested that we should become moral gamblers. I think we should gamble and make bets. We should recognise that we don't know anything. But that's not to say that doing moral psychology will help us to gain new knowledge in ethics any more than understanding psychology has helped us develop physical theories. What the moral psychology does, same thing in the physical case, is takes us away from relying on the wrong justifications. But what did you say? So right at the start of the course, Svenny, you said moral psychology allows us to revisit and reevaluate ethical theories, which are usually based on some common moral intuition. So although you probably didn't know that right at the start, I think you hit the nail on the head there. Likewise, Samuel J., you said, I would like to see if moral psychology has any significant implications for traditional ethical theories. Samuel, I hope you and I have done something towards that already, and perhaps you've got more to say in a longer essay. Anna, you said, ethics. I was curious as to why there wasn't much reference to psychology and studies of human behaviour, but more based on intuitive theories. I'm curious about that too. My suggestion, Anna, as you know, is that it's a historical accident and not a happy one. Paul Theo, you've got a similar idea. You're intrigued by the heavy reliance on appeals to intuition in normative arguments. I wonder what you're going to provide for me in that longer essay, and Paul Theo, of course, in your dissertation as well. Now, Hannah, you and a couple of other people took a different line here at the beginning. You said, look, I want to do moral psychology because it may build my capacity to critique how people decide what actions are the most ethical, whilst also giving myself time to critique my own ethical beliefs. And here I think we've seen enough to say go slowly. The state of our knowledge in moral psychology is very limited. We know very, very little. To stake life-changing decisions, or even very small decisions in the supermarket, on the moral psychology would be a kind of risky bet. It would be a risky bet. If you, like me, you're trying to be a good moral gambler, then we probably don't want to rely too much on moral psychology in our everyday lives. Likewise, Chris, if we want to create an account of morality, we should be examining the thought processes that go into making a moral judgment. I'm not sure I agree with that, as it turns out. I think that would be right if we follow Foote or Cam. Their approaches to doing ethics do seem to rely on that. So, Chris, I accept that you may well be able to change my mind on this. I certainly held a different view, more in line with yours before, but not anymore. So let's see, Hannah, Chris, where are we with this? Where are we now? I'd love to know what you're thinking at the end of this course. This is, of course, what you said at the beginning. Now, the second reason I gave for studying moral psychology is that it can help us to understand something about political conflict. And this I stand by. I think this is good. We looked in particular at the case of climate change, and I think here that the moral psychology is enormously helpful, although equally frustrating. Now, here's the story. I want to go back to the 4th century BCE, when we have Mencius. Now, I don't know anything about Mencius apart from what I've got from second-hand sources like Norden here. But according to Norden, Mencius held that there are sprouts, and these are incipient tendencies to act, feel, desire, perceive and think in virtuous ways. Each of those sprouts corresponds, says Norden, to a cardinal virtue, which might be benevolence, righteousness, propriety, that's interesting, thinking about purity, wisdom. Mencius says, even in the uncivilized person, these sprouts are active. They manifest themselves from time to time in virtuous reactions to certain situations. Characteristic of each sprout, says Mencius, is a particular set of emotions or attitudes. Gosh, You know what? That sounds an awfully familiar kind of view here. So you wonder what has happened in the last, I don't know, 2,400 years or so. I can't resist this. This isn't strictly relevant, but I do think it's quite funny. So this is Mencius. He says, someone suddenly saw a child about to fall into a well. Think about Peter Singer here. Everyone in such a situation would have a feeling of alarm and compassion, not because one sought to get in good with the child's parents, nor because one wanted fame among their neighbours and friends, not because one would dislike the sound of the child's cries. Well, not only, anyway, not only. Gosh, if any of my children fall into a well, Mencius, I hope you're around to pull them out. So what kind of progress have we made since Mencius in the 4th century? I think it's very striking that you wouldn't have much to say about that if you were looking at contemporary ethics. The big breakthrough, I think, comes with moral foundations theory, which promises to provide an understanding of cultural differences, which has inspired a lot of research, including, importantly, moral reframing, something which might prove effective to change people's minds on climate change. We're just at the beginning of that, but there's some good chance that it will work. But moral foundations theory itself, of course, is far from perfect. The moral foundations questionnaire fails to exhibit scalar invariance. And I think that's not only because the moral foundations questionnaire is based on research with a rather narrow group of the population rather than the broader, more diverse sample. It's also because the theoretical underpinnings of this questionnaire, that's to say the social intuitionist model of moral judgment, as Graham and Hyde call it, that is just not a correct model. So there's no way that a questionnaire could measure moral foundations in the way that the moral foundations questionnaire is supposed to. That doesn't mean that I'm knocking moral foundations theory. Yes, I want more. I want something better. I want the next theory. I do not think that we can gain knowledge through the moral foundations questionnaire. On the other hand, the exciting thing here is that moral foundations theory shows us, I think for the first time, that we can take a view, we have methods for discovering differences, cultural variation in moral attitudes, and we can gain knowledge about those cultural differences, not based on speculation, but based on repeatable observations. That is an extraordinary breakthrough. And this relates to many of the things you said at the start of the course. Emily, you said, I wondered how morality differs among civilizations, or how it differed through time. My suggestion here is that that's a good question. I think we have made some progress in understanding how you might answer it. Cyrus, you said you're interested in understanding how people come to associate more value to certain ideals or beliefs. That's not exactly what moral foundations is after, but let's hold on to this idea, Cyrus, that you had at the start. Let's see whether we can make more progress with that. Jagoda, acquiring a scientific perspective on ethics and reasons behind our actions and thoughts equips me with knowledge and theory I can apply to consumption and sustainability. So interesting to see how that works out. You haven't said much about that so far to me, but perhaps I'm going to see more of that in the long essay that you write. I'm not sure. It would be very interesting. I think there's hope for that, although of course it's very difficult to make the connection. Lewis, you said we can derive a lot of practical understanding from both psychology and the study of morality to help us interact with the world more effectively. I think that turns out to be optimistic, but somewhat justified by the case of moral reframing, perhaps, arguably. There could be a range of views on that in this course, and it will be interesting to see the arguments. Johannes, you said, I hope to better understand where political polarization comes from and maybe how it can be solved. I think that's right. I share that, and I share the hope that as we improve and build on the successes of moral foundations theory, overcome some of the limits, we're going to be able to do more of that. You and I, as researchers, and perhaps even society as a whole. Georgia, why certain groups in society perceive particular ethical issues to be more pressing than others? Brilliant question. So why is that? And in particular, I think the case of purity is a nice one, because many people on this course come from a more liberal tradition and so do not, on the whole, feel that purity would be much of a moral issue. That isn't something that you would naturally feel very strongly about. Many people in the groups that we interact with, even every day, do of course have different perspectives on ethical issues. Good question, why? Perhaps it's because they have those moral foundations built in. Now, the last reason I gave for wanting to think about moral psychology was that it provides us with some understanding of a basis for human sociality. Humans, like many insects, live in incredibly large groups where we don't know all of the other members in our society. But unlike most large insect societies, we're also not genetically related to each other. So there's this really interesting combination of unlikely attributes, large groupings, but lack of genetic connections. Lack of close genetic connections. How is it the humans have turned that trick? It's through cooperation. The basis, the foundation for that cooperation are the humans' ethical abilities. And that justifies being curious about the ethical abilities. Now, Baldwin, you asked a series of questions which could just be the syllabus for a course on moral psychology. But one of them was very striking. Why are we ethical beings in the first place? Why are we ethical beings in the first place? Baldwin, the simple suggestion that you have seen, I'm not sure what you think about this suggestion, Baldwin, is it's partly because that allows us to interact with each other in everyday life. Anna, relatedly, you said moral psychology is a useful tool linking both science and philosophy to understand our actions and thoughts, and thus answering debates that we can't solve intuitively or scientifically. So I take this to be on the same lines. Now, there's one reason that I didn't give right at the start, which I think is an excellent reason for studying moral psychology, because we can. And I noticed, Bruno, that at the start of the course, you essentially said that. You said, look, I read The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, fantastic. That's part of my interest in moral philosophy, which I studied. My original fascination in the psychological roots of ethical concept still remains. That's what you said at the start. I hope it's true at the end as well. We're studying moral psychology because we can. Shri, you said that you studied psychology and ethics was your favourite module. You wanted something that combines them. I hope you've seen that the combination works reasonably well, even if it's also extremely difficult to make those connections. We don't have textbooks in moral psychology that we can rely on. The research is changing at tremendous speed. It's incredibly difficult to work out what sort of normative and scientific conclusions we can rely on. Louis, you're also another person who I think studied moral psychology because you can. You're interested in completing the chain, as you say, between the neurobiology that you studied elsewhere and ethics going via the psychology and the behaviour. Ben, you said you can imagine that investigating the psychological literature will be rather eye-opening. I hope that's turned out to be true. My sense is that we've got more reason to accept that even than we had at the start. And interesting, you also said, I'm taking this course because I'm not entirely sure what it entails. Intellectual curiosity. Freddie, I'm intrigued. Freddie, I hope you still are. Let's hope so. So where are we in conclusion? I think what we've discovered is that moral psychology comes with many limits, and it also tells us about limits. We're not in a position where we know very much about the processes and abilities that underlie humans' ethical capacities. We should accept that we have limited knowledge about these things. But what we do have already tells us, I think, that there are also limits on our abilities to gain ethical knowledge. And in particular, the fact that we cannot rely on premises that are not justified inferentially to give us information about ethical truths tells us that we also have very limited ethical knowledge as well. I think that's an important and useful conclusion. We know that we don't have very good models of humans' ethical capacities. The leading account of human moral psychology is the stripped-down dual process theory. What we saw there when we were thinking about auxiliary hypotheses is that it's very hard to even pick one simple winning auxiliary hypothesis. We know very little about the kind of ethical principles which underlie humans' abilities. When it comes to cultural variation, it seems to me, again, we should be extremely modest in what we say here. We cannot say for sure that there are, differences in moral foundations between liberals and people who are more socially conservative. That, I think, is a very difficult conclusion to draw given the currently available evidence that we have. But we can say that it's incredibly likely that there will be interesting patterns of cultural variation, and certainly that there will be differences in moral foundations between different groups. The trick is just to identify what causes, culturally and historically, differences in moral foundations to vary. We know, for example, that historical exposure to pathogens is correlated with moral concerns about purity today. That stands up, I think, independently of the moral foundations framework generally. We want more like that. And finally, as far as the politics goes, we have seen that moral psychology can help us to understand maybe a tiny bit about political conflict and maybe a tiny bit about how that conflict can be resolved democratically. The key thing here is that you and I have to accept that we live in a world we're surrounded by people who have really quite different approaches to not just politics but also ethics, that's a very likely thing. It's unlikely that you and I are going to change their ethical views. We have a choice. We can either tackle issues like climate change or global poverty together, democratically, or we can insist on applying our own ethical standards and that people have to do it not just the right things, but for reasons that you or I think are correct. That's probably not the way to go. Moral psychology says, drop your ethics, and go for the bigger goal. Moral psychology is about ethics. Ethics is about life. Thank you very much for taking part in this course. You've been asking some fabulous questions. It's been wonderful where I have to read your work. I'm very much looking forward to reading the longer essay that you're writing on this course. I hope that you'll see we've just been scratching the surface here, and that as you do some further research and thinking and consolidation, you get new ideas that come together and share them with me. Thank you very much. Enjoy the vacation. You've earned it. Work hard next term on the essay, and I will see you in my office hours. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.